So Mardi Gras is almost here. And I hope that you will find some time to let the good times roll. 'Tis the season. But I hope you'll be safe out there because you are very precious to me. And more importantly, you are very precious to God and to God's communion. Now, speaking of the church, you may be surprised to learn that Fat Tuesday in the church is not about the carnival. It's so much more than that. This time of year points to liminality, liminal moments. And by liminal, I mean you're on the verge. We're on the verge of something new, but we're not quite there yet. This time of year points to those liminal moments. Have you ever curled your toes around the edge of a diving board? Have you ever crawled on your stomach to the edge of a very high cliff and looked over it with your clammy fingertips and the top half of your face? These liminal moments have so much to teach us. I like what the Reverend Will Gaffney says about such times. She says, Mardi Gras does not last forever. Ash Wednesday is close behind, and only a split second separates them. Our gospel story today is the story of the Transfiguration. Woohoo! Lent sort of sneaked up on me, I have to say. I've been quite distracted lately. And so I even missed last week. Thank you, Mark Sin, for filling the pulpit for us. And so I've just been out of sorts, and I didn't have a preaching series planned, not until Lent begins. I'll have one for the Lenten season. So this was sort of a standalone sermon. And a lot of times when I'm preaching a standalone kind of sermon, I go to the lectionary, which is just a prescribed group of readings that are assigned for every Sunday. And I looked at it and I said, oh, dang it, Transfiguration Sunday? It's hard to preach this story, is it not, Mark, Dave? Is it not hard to preach the Transfiguration? Well, today is the day that we read this story in our tradition. And today it's the last Sunday before Lent begins, but it's also the last Sunday of Epiphany. And Epiphany is an important word here because Epiphany means manifestation or revelation. Aha, or discovery, eureka. I get it now, only I don't get it. I do not get today's story, the story of the Transfiguration. The only way I know how to describe it to you, the only way I know how to interpret it is to say to you, it's weird. This is a strange story. No preacher, teacher, theologian, biblical scholar has it all figured out. And yet it's important. In 3 of the 4 Gospels, it's included smack dab right in the middle of each Gospel. So it is significant, but it is weird. It makes me think of one of my former professors. I still keep up with him, Will Willimon. And he shares a story about a friend of his in the ministry. And this friend, after many years of service in the church, this friend decided to take a 4.5-month-long sabbatical. Can you imagine? And he came up with this plan that he was going to take 20 Sundays off from the pulpit, this minister. And he broke it in half. For the first 10 Sundays, he would just not go to church. He would skip church altogether and rest. But for the second 10 Sundays, he decided he would travel to various churches to hear a variety of preachers preach. Well, when he returned from his sabbatical, Will Willimon asked his friend, after listening to many sermons from other preachers, what did you learn? And the minister said, I learned that if anybody hears anything from a sermon, it is a miracle. And here's the point. Revelation is miraculous. that you and I could ever share or receive God's truth is a sheer miracle. It is God-given. It is a God-given gift. You see, it's not our doing. Revelation, truth, wisdom, it's not our doing, it's God's doing. We don't find our faith. Our faith finds us. We don't find the truth. God's truth, finds us. I think about one of our forebears, one of the founders of the Methodist movement, John Wesley. He was so educated. He was a preacher's kid. He had gone to the finest of seminaries. He was well-read. And the harder he tried to gain his faith, the less faith he had. In my opinion, as you read about the story of John Wesley and his journey, it took failure. It took him coming all the way over by sea in a boat where he was terrified, by the way. It took him making that long journey. He goes to the colony of Georgia and he fails. Do you know that the Wesley brothers stayed there for about 2 years, I think, and then after they left, they never came back? And I think it took his failure. I think it took him his being really afraid for him to actually have his heart strangely warmed. We don't find our faith. Faith finds us. Revelation is a miracle, and it comes from God. 6 days and 6 characters, that's what we get in today's story. 6 days ago, Jesus tells his disciples that he's going to have to undergo great suffering. He predicts that he's about to die. And this is what he says to his disciples. He says something like, if you want to find your life, you're going to have to give your life away. And now, 6 days later, we get these 6 characters. Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up a very high mountain. And on that mountain, we are told that Jesus' face shines like the sun. His clothes become dazzling white. There's this blinding light. And 2 old prophets, they would have been prominent leaders in the Jewish tradition, Moses and Elijah, appear with Jesus. Something significant is happening here on that mountain. It is so significant. It is so awe-filled. It's so powerful that Peter, the chief disciple, leader of leaders, the rock of the church, he wants to make it last forever. He wants to hold on to it. He wants to contain it. And all week long, as I've been thinking about this passage, I kept thinking about Albert Einstein, who said, because we haven't learned, insanity is doing the same thing over and over and over and expecting different results. And so what Peter wants to do is he wants to build something. Let's build 3 churches. One for Jesus, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. He wants to hold on to the experience, and he won't quit talking. Talk. He's just gabbing and gabbing away, going on and on as he talks about his future plans, his building campaign. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over and over, expecting different results. And suddenly, a bright cloud overshadows them, and a voice from heaven, God's revelation, says this: "This is my Son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." Do you hear an echo in the room? This is not the first time we've ever heard God speak in this way. When's the last time God speaks this way? Do you remember? Baptism. At the beginning of the gospel, right before Jesus launches his public ministry, he goes to the River Jordan. John the Baptizer baptizes him, and the voice of heaven comes from afar, and it says of this person, Jesus, "This is my Son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased." Now, if you take these 2 verses, the first is at the beginning of the gospel, and now in the middle of the gospel, right before Jesus is headed to the cross. Look how similar those verses are. They're practically saying the same thing, but this time we get tacked on Those words in yellow, read them with me. Listen to him. Now, we know if God says the same thing pretty much twice, that it's got to be important. And I suspect when God says those last three words, they have to be pretty important. Say them with me again. Listen to him. Listen to him. It's a mountaintop moment, this transfiguration is. And they have to head down. It doesn't last. Elijah and Moses, they vanish. And Jesus and the disciples come back down to finish the rest of the story. I've been thinking about mountains and the symbolism they have, not just in the Bible, but in the ancient world. In the ancient world, a mountain symbolized the center of the world. Mountains, even today, they evoke in us power and awe. They're holy of holy places. And in the ancient world, a mountain was a place where God's revelation unfolded. Think about Moses in Mount Sinai and the unfolding of the Ten Commandments. I thought about in Matthew's Gospel, because that's where we are today, I thought about the Sermon on the Mount, thinking about listening to him, and I summarized some of what Jesus said here. Blessed are the poor, the peacemakers, and the persecuted. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. Love your enemies. Give, pray, fast. But don't do these things for show. You can't serve two masters. Do not worry. Did y'all hear that, church? Do not worry. Do not judge. Ask. Search, knock. And in everything, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Beware of false prophets and be hearers and doers of the word. The word of God for us, the people of God. In his wonderful book, Falling Upward. If you haven't read it, it's a great one. It's by Richard Rohr. In this book, he talks about there being two halves of life. In the first half of life, we're building our lives, We're earning our education. We are building our careers. We're building our families. We are figuring out what makes our heart sing, our passions, and we're cultivating and building who we are. That's the first half of life. And for some of us, it might last a really long time, but we're building our lives. The second half of life begins to happen when we reach this threshold, this liminal kind of place. There's no set formula here. It just depends on the person and the circumstances. Somebody may stay in the first half of their life through their 80s. So you can't put a numerical figure around this. It's just at some point, the trajectory of your life begins to shift, and it's a significant turn. And much of the Gospels, as I read them, really have to do with this second half of life, where Jesus says to us, if you want to find your life, you'll do what with it? You'll lose it. You'll give it away. Now, I underestimated in the spiritual journey for a long, long time how important that first half of life is. If you're not aware of your sacred worth, and you don't have a healthy self-esteem, and you don't know who you are, you won't be able to give anything away. So that stage, that half of life is very important, and I hope as a church we help those of you in that first half to build your lives in such a way that when you get to the second half, you'll have something to share and to give away and to pour out. For what will it profit you if you gain the whole world but forfeit your life? What will you give in return for your life? So most of the Gospels don't really have to do, in my opinion, with that first half of life. This is why I don't get too troubled I mean, I'm all about handing down the church to our younger generation, and we need to do that if we're going to survive. But I'm really not all that worried about church survival. I'm more worried about the kingdom of God. And so if we're a church with seasoned people, I'll say it that way, we're in luck. We're blessed. Because most of the gospel, it seems to me, has to do with that second half of life. We have to have a life that we have built with the help of God so that we can give it away. Richard Rohr describes this turning, the second half of life, as an inner shining, an inner brightness. In the second half of life, he says, our actions are less compulsive. We do what we are called to do, and we try then to let go of the consequences. We let go of the outcome. And he adds, we usually, no offense first half people, but we usually cannot do that very well when we are young. Are you following me? I'm going to do now what I was told in preaching classes never to do, and I'm going to read to you. This is from his book, Falling Upward. He's talking about the second half of life. This is human life, he says, in its crowning, and all else has been preparation and prelude for creating such a human work of art. The second half of life, he says, it always deeply saddens me when old folks, his word, not mine, he says, it deeply saddens me when old folks are still full of themselves and their absolute opinions about everything. Somehow they have not taken their needed place in the social fabric. We need their deep and studied passion so much more than their superficial and loudly stated principles. We need their peace more than their anger. Yes, the second half of life is a certain kind of weight to carry, but no other way of being makes sense or gives you the deep satisfaction your soul now demands and even enjoys. This new and deeper passion is what people mean when they say, I must do this particular thing or my life will not make sense, or it is no longer a choice. Your life and your delivery system are now one, whereas before your life and your occupation seemed like two different things. Your concern, this is important, I'm about to finish. Your concern, he writes, is not so much to have what you love anymore, but to love what you have right now. This is a monumental change from the first half of life, so much so that it is almost the litmus test of whether you are in the second half of life at all. So I want to ask you, where are you? Both are important. But I want you to think about today in this Lenten season. Are you in the first half where you have to have what you love? You're seeking out what makes your heart sing. Who's God calling me to be in relationship? What should I do with my life? Where should I go to school? Are you in that first half? Or have you made the transition? Maybe you're in a liminal place, but have you shifted to loving what you have? It's an important shift. And knowing the difference and knowing where you are makes all the difference. And wherever you are, the first half, second half, the message is the same. Hear the good news. Say it with me. Listen to him. Listen to the one who calls you the beloved. And remember who you truly are. God's beloved child. With whom, this is very important, with whom God is very well pleased. Final point, and I'm going to wrap things up. Already mentioned that most of the gospel really addresses that second half of life. And that's because the gospels are all about the life of Jesus. And we don't know from the Gospels very much about his growing up years. We don't know what his first half of life really looked like. You get a little bit, but not much. If you look to Luke chapter 2, what we learn from the scripture about Jesus is that he grew. Jesus grew in wisdom and stature. I like the translation. Jesus grew in wisdom and in maturity, and he became more and more pleasing to God and to people. But did Jesus really grow more pleasing to God? I don't think so. It's not congruent with the Gospels, because that would mean it would be about him, that he had to get better, that he had to earn something, that he had to do something. You see, I think that Jesus was pleasing to God at all times, at his birth, at his baptism, as he prepares to endure the cross and beyond. But here's what happened. Epiphany. Revelation. Aha. I get it. Over time, Jesus discovered precisely who he was. God's beloved, with whom God was very, very pleased. And the way Jesus works is because he knew who he was, most truly, he was able to endure even the cross, God's purpose for his life, which led to the resurrection. And Jesus shares this power. Jesus doesn't try to hoard it, build a booth, or even a church. Jesus doesn't try to contain this power. Instead, Jesus shares it and says to his disciples, and all these years later, Jesus is saying to you and to me, follow me. And if you want to gain your life, you'll do what? You'll give it away. And it all begins in our listening. So listen to him and let the good times roll. And I will see you all on Wednesday. So be it, and so it is.